Harriet Tubman. It's a name we all know, right? We all learn the story of the brave conductor on the Underground Railroad. But what if I told you that story, the one we all know, is just the beginning? Today, we're going to go way beyond that to reveal a master tactician, a brilliant intelligence operative, and a military commander who literally reshaped American history.
Seriously, when you hear her name, what's the first thing that pops into your head? The Underground Railroad? For sure. But what if all of that was just the warm-up act? What if her most daring, most incredible work actually happened on the battlefields of the Civil War?
Because Harriet Tubman wasn't just a conductor. You see, she was a military strategist, a top spy for the Union Army, the commander of an armed raid, and on top of all that, a fierce advocate for women's right to vote, and a humanitarian who took care of her community right up until her very last days. This is the whole picture.
But look, to really get the commander, the spy, the strategic genius, you have to go back. You have to understand the brutal world that created her. Her story really begins in the crucible of slavery on Maryland's eastern shore.
She was born Araminta Ross, Minty for short, and her childhood was, honestly, one trauma after another. At just 5 years old, she was hired out and whipped for things that weren't her fault. Then, as a teenager, a single act of violence would change her life, her mind, and her body forever. And then, in 1849, she did the unthinkable. She escaped, all alone on a 90-mile trek to freedom that would become the very blueprint for everything she did next. And this was that moment. She was trying to help another enslaved person get away when an overseer grabbed a 2-pound lead weight and hurled it, not at the man who was running, but at her. It hit her square in the head and fractured her skull. And with no real medical care, they just sent her right back into the fields, bleeding and in unimaginable pain. That injury left her with a lifelong condition. Today, doctors would probably call it post-traumatic narcolepsy. She'd have these sudden sleeping spells, and with them came these incredibly powerful, vivid visions. But here's the thing, Tubman never saw this as a disability. To her, these were messages from God. They were divine premonitions that gave her this absolute, unwavering certainty, and basically a roadmap for her missions. And it was that certainty that guided her as she became the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. But her success, it wasn't just about faith. It was about meticulous planning and military-grade precision. Just think about this for a second. Over a decade, she personally led about 13 missions back into Maryland. 13 times, with a huge bounty on her head, she willingly walked back into the very place she'd escaped from. And on those trips, she guided around 70 people directly to freedom herself. Her record was perfect. She never lost a passenger. Not one. So the question is, how on earth did she pull that off? Well, it wasn't luck. It was a playbook, a brilliant, repeatable strategy. She'd always leave on a Saturday night because she knew runaway notices couldn't get into the newspapers until Monday morning. That gave her a critical 2-day head start. She loved winter missions because the nights were longer and colder, providing more cover. She used coded spirituals, changing the speed of a song to signal if it was safe to come out or if danger was near. And she always carried a pistol, making it crystal clear that turning back wasn't an option. One person getting caught could doom the entire network. Okay, so then, in 1850, the whole game just gets upended. The Fugitive Slave Act is passed, which means even the so-called free states in the North were no longer safe. So what did she do? Quit? Not a chance. She just adapted. She extended her routes and forged new paths all the way to Canada, where American slave catchers had no power. So you see, all of this work, the stealth, the strategy, leading people under insane pressure, it was all practice. It was her training ground. Because when the Civil War finally erupted, Harriet Tubman was more than ready to take her fight from the secret trails of Maryland to the battlefields of the nation. And people knew it too. Even before the war, the radical abolitionist John Brown, he called her General Tubman. He said she was a better officer than most men he'd ever seen and believed she could command a whole army. And you know what? He was about to be proven right. So in 1862, she heads down to South Carolina. She starts out as a nurse, but the Union Army, they saw what she could really do. They tasked her with building a spy network from scratch. She recruited 9 local black men, mostly river pilots, who knew every inch of those swamps and waterways, and built an espionage ring that operated deep behind enemy lines. And all that intelligence work led to this, her absolute masterpiece of an operation, the Combahee River Raid. The planning was brilliant. First, her spy network gathered crucial intel, mapping out Confederate supply depots, and even pinpointing the location of underwater torpedoes in the river. Then, with that intel, she personally guided 3 Union gunboats up that treacherous river in the dead of night. They hit the shore, destroyed plantations and Confederate supplies. And then came the signal. The boats blasted their whistles, a sound of liberation echoing through the night. The result? In a single raid, over 750 enslaved people heard those whistles, ran to the river, and boarded those boats. Gone. Free. This wasn't just a raid. It was one of the single biggest liberation events of the entire war.
I mean, just let that sink in for a moment. The Combahee River Raid made Harriet Tubman the very first woman in American history to plan and lead an armed military assault. Spy, commander, liberator, she did it all.
But, the war ends, and you'd think her fight would be over. Nope, not even close. Now she had to fight a whole new kind of enemy, bureaucracy. For 34 years, she fought a 34-year battle to get a military pension. For 3 years of service as a scout, a spy, and a commander, she was paid just $200. It wasn't until 1892 that she was granted a pension for $8 a month as the widow of a veteran. Finally, in 1899, they increased it to $20 a month, but specifically for her work as a nurse. The government officially refused to recognize her military command.
Maybe the person who understood her unique brand of heroism best was the great Frederick Douglass himself. He made this incredible contrast between his own work, the public speeches, the writing, the applause, and her quiet, incredibly dangerous missions. He worked in the day, she worked in the night. He actually wrote this to her in a letter. He said, "The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom." His reward was public acclaim. Hers was the quiet, "God bless you," from the people she saved. It's such a powerful distinction. So when you take a step back and look at the whole picture, you see a life that just refused to be defined by any one thing. It was a constant evolution, a nonstop fight for liberation in every form. I mean, think about the arc of her life. It starts with her own personal freedom, then expands to freeing her family, and then to freeing hundreds more. She transformed the trauma of a brain injury into a source of spiritual power and command. After fighting to free bodies from slavery, she fought to free women's voices in the fight for suffrage. And finally, she turned her own home into a home for the elderly and the poor, continuing her humanitarian mission to the very end. Which really leaves us with this one big question. Conductor, commander, humanitarian. How does one person, born with absolutely nothing and forged in violence, manage to so completely redefine what it even means to fight for freedom? Her life is proof that the greatest leaders aren't always the ones standing in the spotlight. Sometimes they're the ones guided by the silent stars.